Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Chivalry II for PC, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a multiplayer action game that's primarily hack and slash melee combat, but there are some ranged options as well. That was developed by Torn Banner Studios and published by Tripwire Interactive in June of 2021. Although you might as well have considered that the second open beta release because it was Epic Games Store exclusive, and it didn't get released on Steam until June of 2022, so that's why I'm taking a look at it now instead of back then. To put it simply, Epic Games Store is absolute trash, and therefore I want absolutely nothing to do with it. Therefore, I treat any game with Epic Games Store exclusivity as releasing effectively a year later than it actually does. So that's what we ended up with in Chivalry II. The question is, though, was that wait worth it? Because that's basically a whole year's worth of updates and additional content that they added into the game. So in theory, they should have stamped out all the bugs and performance issues, and this should effectively be the best version of the game that's available at the time I'm recording this video. But there's actually something a lot more important to keep in mind than simply the year's worth of effective development that this had post-Epic Games Store exclusive launch. It's that Chivalry II isn't the only medieval multiplayer hack-and-slash game on the market anymore. You see, back when the original Chivalry Medieval Warfare was released, it was really the only game of its type on the market. And at that time, for what it was pretty fantastic. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 at the time. They released the Deadliest Warrior DLC for it, and that was a pretty decent DLC. And then eventually we got Mirage Arcane Warfare from the same developers, which was a sort of magic-based spin-off of Chivalry Medieval Warfare that frankly just wasn't as good, and it died out fairly quickly. But then we get to 2019, and a different developer makes the game Mordhau, which was absolutely fantastic. It was better than Chivalry Medieval Warfare in pretty much every conceivable way, especially in the combat system, which was just much more complex, much more responsive, much faster, and frankly just a lot better in general. It felt like a proper evolution of that gameplay style, and it was just a really fun game to boot. Fast forward a couple of months, and we get to E3 of 2019, and that's when they officially unveiled Chivalry II to the public. And that, of course, eventually leads us to today, where Chivalry II is not only out, but it's had several content updates, and it's also had a lot of bug fixes done over the period that the Epic Games Store customers were basically beta testing for everybody else. So how did Torn Banner change and improve things compared to Chivalry Medieval Warfare, and of course learn from their mistakes with Mirage Arcane Warfare, and how does this stack up compared to its competition? Well, let's just go ahead and delve right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. This runs on Unreal Engine 4, and it generally makes pretty good use of the engine. It's got some very nice modeling, some very nice textures, the shader quality is very good, it has some very nice particle effects, and it also helps that, much like the original Chivalry Medieval Warfare, this is quite a gory game, and it ends up making the combat a bit more satisfying when you're seeing limbs and heads and such flying all over the place in the middle of a battle. Where it does fall fairly short, however, is in the animations, which certainly get the job done, but they're pretty sluggish and clunky. And the problem isn't so much that the animations themselves are sluggish and clunky, it's that they were intentionally sluggish and clunky for gameplay mechanical reasons, which I'll explain more in a moment. So in other words, the animations themselves being sluggish and clunky isn't really the problem, it's the impact they have on the gameplay. Again, I'll explain more about that later on. As for the rest of the visuals, there's really not much to complain about. They've got a good array of customization options for your characters, so there's a pretty good variety of equipment available, and it's all modeled and detailed quite well. And the environments also have quite a lot of detail, so the maps look good, the general game looks good, it's just those animations that look off. And none of this really comes at the cost of performance. The game does run at a pretty smooth 60 plus frames per second at most times. There are a few moments here and there you may notice that the frame rate does dip a bit, but for the most part I was running this thing in the 60 to 90 FPS range on my i7 4790K 16 gigs of RAM and a GTX 1080. And that's everything maxed out at 1080p, so obviously your mileage might vary depending on whether you go for 1440p or 4K, and obviously depending on what hardware you have as well. But overall, they've done a very good job with the visuals and the optimization. But what about the sound design? Well, they've also done a very good job with that. All of the sound effects have some nice impact behind them, and you get some really nice visceral, gory sounds when you're getting into the thick of melee combat. And that's all being accompanied by the screaming and yelling and taunting of the various characters as they get eviscerated or just shout their battle cries or insults or whatever the case may be. The end result there is a cacophony of noise that is very fitting for a medieval battlefield. And the noise of battle is accompanied by an orchestral soundtrack that is also pretty fitting for a medieval fantasy game, although it's not really leaning too hard into the fantasy here. It's very much medieval, but it's much more grounded than you would normally expect when someone says medieval fantasy. So as far as the sound design goes, there's really not much to complain about at all. They've done a very good job with that, and when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that is quite solid. It's certainly not jaw-droppingly gorgeous or anything, but they've done a very good job with what they have. It looks good, it sounds good, and it performs well. And it's definitely a noticeable step up in quality over Torn Banner's previous work, which admittedly is expected given that the original Chivalry came out almost a decade ago now, and Mirage Arcane Warfare came out a few years ago, but hey, credit's due where it's due. But as solid as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, or rather lack of story in this case, because this game doesn't have a single-player campaign or anything like that. It has a tutorial and an offline practice mode, and that's really all you get in terms of single-player content. And even once you get into the game itself and start getting into matches, the most you're getting in terms of story is a very basic setup for what the map is themed around. So it'll say something like, the Mason Order is attacking this position to do this, or the Agathians are seeking revenge on such and such, so they're attacking this area. There's really not much to it. The only thing you really need to know as far as the setup of this setting goes is that the blue team are the Knights of Agatha, and the red team are the Mason Order, and they are locked in conflict for reasons that are only barely touched upon in both Chivalry Medieval Warfare and Chivalry II. It's really just set up for general gameplay that you're going to be experiencing, so it really doesn't matter. This means the only thing that really matters here is the gameplay itself, and this is a first and third person melee action game, but with some projectile combat in the form of bows, crossbows, and thrown weapons. When you jump into a match, you'll be able to select one of 4 classes, each of which levels up individually, and as that class levels up, you'll gradually unlock new weapons to be able to use, as well as new variants of that class with some different equipment loadouts. So for example, when you pick the Archer class, you'll have one of 3 subtypes, one that uses bows, one that uses crossbows, and one that uses javelins. But you'll only start out being able to use the Bowman class. You'll have to unlock the crossbow and the javelin subtypes. And then within the class itself, you'll start out being able to use a basic bow, but eventually you'll be able to unlock a warbow, which is slower but considerably more powerful. And right off the bat, you might be seeing a potential issue, and it is certainly a problem in Chivalry II, although certainly not quite as bad as it was in the original Chivalry. That is that there are certain weapons that are just flat out better than the ones you start with. And they can take quite a long grind for you to be able to unlock them. As I said, Chivalry 1 had the same exact problem, except it was much worse in Chivalry 1, because the progression in the original Chivalry was downright glacial. The progression in Chivalry 2 is certainly much better, but you still have a situation where you are getting gameplay-affecting unlocks that are at a fairly slow pace, and you end up having to just grind your way through them before you can play a class optimally, in air quotes there. Now, I'm sure there will certainly be some Chivalry 2 fanboys in the comments saying things like, well, DW, you're just saying that because you suck at the game or something like that. And you know what? Sure, if you're really good at the game, then the difference in equipment really doesn't matter. But frankly, the same can be said for literally any game that has even a modicum of skill requirement. And that's not going to change the simple fact that people who've just played the game longer, whether they're actually any good at the game or not, have an equipment advantage over people who are just starting out. The sad part is they could have completely fixed this problem by just having all of the gameplay affecting stuff unlocked at the start, so that people could experiment with the different weapon types and find something that works for them, as well as something that's really optimal for whatever character type they're playing, and then they could just focus on getting all of the cosmetic unlocks in the actual progression. Thing is, they have cosmetic unlocks in the progression. You level up your weapons, you level up your classes, you level up in general, and that will unlock different things that you can purchase with the in-game currency you earn by playing. And the game has quite a few cosmetic options available, so they've done a pretty decent job with the cosmetic progression, but then they go and spoil that by having an equipment grind. You'd think they would have learned their lesson after Chivalry 1 and Mirage Arcane Warfare, but apparently they didn't. But anyway, once you've picked your class and picked your loadout, then you go into the battle and you are put into one of multiple game modes. These are the objective-based modes, where you have a series of objectives you need to complete as either the attacking or defending team, as well as a basic team deathmatch mode, which is exactly like it would be in pretty much any other game that has a team deathmatch mode. Same with the free-for-all mode. And then there's also the two arena modes, which are 1v1 duels and 3v3 arena bouts. And right off the bat, there are some issues with the way these are set up. The 1v1 duels and the 3v3 arena bouts are entirely matchmaking. You don't have the option of selecting any kind of servers for them, so you're completely at the mercy of whoever happens to be queuing up in those modes at any given moment. And while individual skill doesn't matter anywhere near as much in the team modes, it does matter in free-for-all and especially the 1v1 and 3v3 modes, so there's a very high chance you're just going to be matched up with people who are just going to curb stomp you, which is never fun. And what you'll actually find with Chivalry 2's modes is that the free-for-all, duel, and arena modes are really not very good, and a lot of that comes down to the combat system. Now, of course, Chivalry 1 had a combat system where you had vertical slashes, horizontal slashes, and thrusts, and you could parry and feint. But there really wasn't all that much to the combat system, and it was pretty clunky all around. Now, of course, at the time the original Chivalry released, there really wasn't anything else on the market that had even remotely similar of a combat system, so it was pretty much the gold standard for its day. But that was almost a decade ago. We would expect some refinement over the years, and we got a bit of that with Mirage Arcane Warfare, although really not much. It was just slightly smoother and more fluid than what we saw in the original Chivalry, but it was still fundamentally the same combat system. And then, of course, we got Mordhau, which introduced quite a few extra elements like chambering, additional attack directions, and a generally much faster and more responsive combat system than anything we had seen previously in this particular type of multiplayer melee action game. And it raised the bar pretty considerably for what we would expect from the genre going forward. Which is why it's really annoying that Chivalry 2 has almost the exact same combat system as the original Chivalry, but with the parry being changed from a momentary parry into a static block that you can hold down as long as you have enough stamina for it, the introduction of heavy attacks where you just hold the attack button down and you'll do a more powerful attack, although it has a longer windup, and some tweaks to the speed at which you can counterattack after parrying an incoming attack. And while it is a combat system that does have some amount of skill involved, it's a lot easier to pick up and play this than the likes of, say, Mordhau. That's not necessarily a good thing, though. Sure, it's easier to pick it up and play it, but it also means that the skill ceiling is a lot lower in Chivalry 2 than it is in Mordhau, and you're not going to get the kind of intense, fast, back-and-forth duels that you get in something like Mordhau. In fact, if you've played both, then you'll know right off the bat that the combat in Chivalry 2 feels extremely slow and clunky by comparison. it ends up being this weird situation where it's slow and clunky and certainly easier to get used to than the likes of Mordhau, but it's also much weaker in terms of 1v1 gameplay, which is where something like Mordhau really excels. This is considerably less of a problem when you go into the larger modes, so free-for-all or team deathmatch or the team-based objective modes, where you can compensate for the clunkiness by just going in and fighting in groups. This unfortunately has the side effect of you will probably hit your teammates by accident quite frequently, but there's only so much you can do about that. The important point there is really just that it helps to compensate for the inherent clunkiness of the system and how weak it is in 1v1 engagements. Thing is, that really only applies to the melee combat, which admittedly is the majority of combat in the game. But what about ranged combat? Well, that comes in two forms. Either you play as an archer class, or you just throw whatever weapons you are carrying around. Regardless of which one you're doing, you'll find out fairly quickly that the physics for the ranged combat are really weird. Whenever you shoot a bow or a crossbow or throw a weapon, it's always treated as a projectile that has a travel time, so you need to lead your targets, and you also need to adjust for the distance, so you may need to aim higher than the enemy in order for the shot to go down on them. That's all well and good when it works. You see, a lot of the time you'll be shooting arrows at enemies or you'll be throwing your weapons at them, and what you could swear should have hit will just not hit anything. You might shoot an arrow at them, you'll see the arrow trail go directly into the enemy, and nothing happens. You might throw your weapon at an enemy, it might even connect with them or stick in them, and still do no damage. There's just a distinct lack of consistency when it comes to the ranged combat, and it makes that way more frustrating than it should be. And it really just speaks to a hit registration problem in general. You'll notice this sometimes with the melee attacks too. You'll swing and it will look like the attack should have hit the enemy, but instead it just ghosts right through them. Or you might swing at an enemy, they may not even be facing you, and somehow they can still block it even though you're attacking them from the rear or something. It's certainly less of a problem in melee combat, but it is still there, and that general lack of consistency makes the combat a hell of a lot less satisfying than it really could be. I mean, think about it this way, all of the melee combat itself should be satisfying enough, and of course even getting ranged kills should be satisfying enough, but what about when you add insult to injury by throwing an anvil at someone, or throwing a fish or a cabbage at someone? Because you can do all of that. That is one of the features that Chivalry II has, and the developers are quite proud of. You can pick up a whole bunch of random things in the environment and use them as weapons, and in theory, that should be really satisfying and fun and just downright silly. And sometimes it is, but more often than not, because everything is so inconsistent with the hit registration, it just ends up being kind of pointless. And that's really the big sticking point with all of this here. It's not necessarily that the combat is bad, because it's not. It's actually pretty decent combat. It's just that a lot of the time it just doesn't work properly, and so you end up having to compensate for that by playing things like the team objective modes and focusing more on the objectives themselves than the actual combat. And sure, the objective mode in Chivalry 2 is pretty robust and has a pretty wide variety of things that you'll be doing as either attacker or defense, and it is a rather satisfying game mode in and of itself. It's just that it's not as satisfying and fun as it really could be if everything actually worked properly. Instead, a lot of the time you'll just find yourself wondering either just what happened in general because it was just such a mess you couldn't tell what happened, or why something didn't hit, or why something did hit. And that's not even counting some of the miscellaneous weird things that happen in Chivalry 2 that leave you just scratching your head wondering why they haven't fixed it yet, like some weird issues with spawning sometimes where you'll get stuck on things, or things that are just generally baffling decisions, like when you get your left arm chopped off and you have a brief period of time where you can attack enemies and maybe get a kill and that will stabilize you, which is certainly a fairly amusing feature, but more importantly, why does it also go into that mode if your right arm gets chopped off and you can no longer attack? I mean, that seems like it might be a glitch, but it's actually not. That's just how the game is designed, so it leaves you scratching your head wondering what the hell they were thinking. That's certainly not to say you can't have fun playing Chivalry 2, because you can have fun playing Chivalry 2. When everything's firing on all cylinders, it can be quite a fun game. The problem is that most of the time it's really firing only half of the cylinders at best. I mean, hell, one of the big things they push with this game is the 64-player matches, which are only accessible in matchmaking. You can't just go into the server browser and find 64-player servers. It's all 40 players or less. So if you want to play a 64-player match, well, good luck with that, because you're entirely at the mercy of the matchmaking. Most of the time, it's going to put you in a server that has a decent connection to you, but sometimes you might be put into a region where you aren't getting a good connection, and there's not really anything you can do about it. Now, is it worth actually going through the matchmaking and just dealing with whatever it throws you into? Well, yes and no. I mean, it's a 64-player mode, which is always going to be a bit more chaotic and frenetic than what you get with the 40-player modes. But given that this is primarily a melee action game, in practice it really doesn't make all that much of a difference. At the end of the day, it's still down to whoever you're playing with and whether they're actually working together as a team to achieve whatever the objectives are for whatever team you're on. Sure, having the extra players on any given team is going to increase their overall capabilities, but if they're not working together all that well, then it's really not going to make all that much of a difference whether they have more people or not. Especially considering that the game is inherently biased in favor of the attacking team on most of the maps. Sure, some of the defense's inability to deal with the situations is down to a lack of teamwork and such, but when a lot of the objectives just require the attackers to run in and attack static objects, or defenseless peasants, or just grab a torch and throw it at something, or just standing nearby something while it moves along, it just means you're dealing with effectively a battle of attrition that the defenders are usually going to lose unless they are really well coordinated. And it's going to be that way regardless of whether you're playing on a 40-player server or a 64-player server. There's only so much you can do with that. And it certainly doesn't help when a lot of people know this already, and so they will intentionally go over to the attacking team on any given map, specifically so they can win more easily. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you can't win if you're on the defensive team, and on certain maps it does favor the defenders a bit more, but there is a clear, noticeable balancing problem that is fairly annoying. And the new content they've added in over the course of the game's life hasn't really helped that either. The new maps that they've introduced and the new faction play that they've introduced with the Tenosian Invasion update suffers from all of the same problems, only it also has the problem of being noticeably undercooked. I mean, if you look at all of the customization options you have for the Agathians and the Masons, you've got quite a lot of customization available. And then you look at the Tenosians, and they have basically 3 armor sets, and that's about it. I mean, sure, the faction was only added in relatively recently, but it's still a very limited amount of customization options, and to make matters worse, they've basically blocked off all the Tenosian Invasion content into its own matchmaking queue. I have played some of the standalone servers where it did come up occasionally, but usually it was just Agathians versus Masons, and not the new Tenosian Invasion content, which is noticeably different. I mean, it's on entirely different maps, it features cavalry content as a major new feature, and it's very, very janky cavalry combat, but it is a thing now. And the 2 factions you're going to be playing as in those are only going to be the Mason Order and the Tenosians, but you still have the attacker-defender imbalance, and it's all the same core mechanics as all the other maps. It's just that now you have cavalry thrown into the mix and some new maps to mess around with. And of course, by it being in its own separate matchmaking queue and pretty much nothing else, that makes it feel like a total afterthought rather than a proper content expansion. That's not to say that the Tenosian Invasion content can't be enjoyable, because it can be, much like the rest of Chivalry 2 can, but it's hard to shake a general feeling of disappointment, and that's something that I kept coming back to as I was trying to go through Chivalry 2 for reviewing. The more I was playing it, the more I was saying things like, well, this isn't really bad, but it's really underwhelming given that it's been almost a decade since the original Chivalry, and the sequel is really just more of the same but with some gimmicks and a few tweaks. It's just a generally quite underwhelming experience if you played the original Chivalry and followed up with additional games in the genre since, like Mirage Arcane Warfare and of course Mordhau. A better looking version of a game that's nearly a decade old at this point really just doesn't cut it anymore. Again, you can certainly have fun playing Chivalry II, and I wouldn't say it's a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a very underwhelming sequel to a game that was pretty much genre-defining, and as such, the best I can really rate it at is a 3 out of 5. Ultimately, the experience is going to be fairly subjective for you depending on how much into the team objective modes you are, because if you are really into that, then Chivalry 2 will probably be something you'll be able to enjoy quite a lot. But even if you are really into the team objective modes, you're still going to have to put up with the wonky hit registration and the generally janky mechanics of quite a lot of things. So even if you have already decided you're going to pick up Chivalry 2, I would very highly suggest waiting for a sale. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or getting new equipment, or replacing broken equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.